certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
The DNA on a silk kimono left behind during the Huntingdale sex attack is 100 billion times more likely to be from Bradley Edwards than anyone else. Welcome back to Claremont in Conversation. This is day 53. Natalie Bonjolo, Tim Clark and Alison Pham with you. And Tim, yesterday we talked about the dramatic arrest of Edwards and, well, this was that piece of evidence that led the police to him eventually.
Yes, that's right, Nat. So this is the kimono that we have touched on over the journey, and we got to the actual testing of it today. So this is the kimono that was left behind at the Huntingdale break-in in 1988, was briefly looked at by police, and then briefly spent some time at Pathwest, and then went into a box in storage for 28 years or so. And then the cold case detectives who were working on dozens of cold cases at the time in Perth pulled this box and sent this kimono off for more testing at Pathwest. It wasn't actually DNA tested at all back in 1988, but it certainly was in 2016. And the very first stain that they looked at on that kimono, which was on the left sleeve, they did the presumptive tests. It came back presumptive for semen. They did the full test and got a major, a full profile, very strong single male contributor. And as we've described, when that was then run through the DNA database on the 1st of December 2016, it came back as a match to what the police at that time were then referring to as case 01/2009, which was the Claremont case and the Karrakatta rape case that had been bundled together. And so once they got that hit, it was on for all money, as the saying goes.
And Nat, his young victim, was in court today. I was wondering why she'd turned up. And of course that's the sexual assault charge that he has confessed to, admitted to, Bradley Robert Edwards. But I saw her come in and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So that's why, because she knew that they were going to be leading to that assault case where she thought it was actually her boyfriend at the time. Yes. So she didn't panic,
And so she obviously realised that forensics today would be speaking to this kimono. And of course we do know that Bradley Edwards initially denied this crime when these charges were put to him.
Yes, he did indeed, Nat. It took him basically up until about a month before this trial began in last year for him to admit those in open court, which he did, which we covered quite extensively at the time in the paper, obviously, and various other media were there and stunned, really, with that development, as was the victim, very relieved, I'm sure, but very surprised also. And she's made quite numerous appearances in court, including this week. And as Ali said, she was there today to hear about the forensic journey that this kimono went on over nearly 3 decades.
I think that statistic that you just quoted probably prompted him to plead guilty to both those charges, saying that, yes, that was me, although he is saying, but I'm not a killer.
I mean, I guess what I found interesting is that the prosecution say that he feigned absolute, disbelief about his DNA being on this kimono.
Yeah, that's right. That's in the interview, which we are yet to see. So we haven't seen those denials yet. We will in due course. Mr. Egan, this is Scott Egan, who is the reporting scientist in the case, which is the scientist given the overall responsibility for all the results, analysing them, interpreting them, and then reporting them to court. So he's obviously very, very senior in the process. And it was he who was laying out the various tests done on all the exhibits, or began to do that today.
It's interesting, Tim, Andrew McDonald, who was the UK forensic expert we're talking about, he is now at Pathwest.
Yeah, that is interesting. Talking about forensic journeys, he's been on one as well because he began his career at FSS, which we know is very central to this case, then at Cellmark, which has become more central, and now he's actually moved across the world.
To replace those that he had to name today as being contaminating
to
evidence,
where he had to name some names today, including Mr. Egan, who was one of the four contaminators of the evidence, which his lab tested in 2017 and 18.
Tim, Scott Egan was asked about the lab setup and whether they kept a logbook at all. What was the relevance of that?
Yeah, so he was asked to describe some maps that he'd drawn of the lab, various lab setups and various lab layouts back in '96, and then as the lab got bigger, how the setup changed. And included in that were where the phones in the lab were actually situated. It was slightly surprising to me that he said there was actually a phone on one of the DNA extraction benches, which you would think would be super airtight and clean and tidy and not have any sort of
contamination,
outside influence on it. But it did have a phone on it. But what he was asked to describe was who had access to those phones, who had access to those labs, and of particular interest, when work needed to be done from an outside contractor, for instance, inside the lab, how would they get in, and what type of record would be kept of who was in there. And Mr. Egan said, in fact, that there had been a logbook kept every year, going back to '95, and they still existed. And he had gone back and looked through them all to see if a B. Edwards had ever signed into Pathwest at any point from '95 onwards, and he said there hadn't been. But what he did say was there had been other Telstra employees that had worked in the lab over that period of time, but he didn't say who they were. So Telstra was there, but Mr. Edwards wasn't there over those years.
Because they have been asking that question over and over. How many times were the phones serviced? Who came in? Were they Telstra people, presumably wearing the blue fibre trousers? Interesting one.
Now, Scott Egan was a witness today, but he was also named in court in really what would be not a great day for the prosecution in terms of the contamination issues.
And possibly quite embarrassing for Mr. McDonald, who's now talking about his colleagues. I noticed he was a little loath to come down and face the cameras. He waited for a while, and that was quite and then he waited to come down with Scott Egan. But I suddenly tweaked, he's naming guys that he's working with as contaminating very crucial evidence. So I think there's a bit of that. And that's obviously he's replaced Laurie Webb too, and still talking about the three that he's working with.
So what were the names that you heard today, the path workers who had contaminated exhibits?
Well, we had Alex Bogdanovich, we had Louise King and Scott Webern, and of course Laurie Webb, who is no longer with Pathwest. I guess those ones, going back to the Times, as they said, the testing at the time, although it did not confirm a match with Bradley Edwards from the samples he was given. Now, we didn't hear about the two crucial samples, AJM 42 and 40. It said it did not exclude him completely either, so we've got to make that quite clear. Although Paul Jovich the defence lawyer seemed very satisfied with what he'd brought out. And the other aspect was some of this other DNA that was found. I found it quite unusual that we had somebody who had nothing to do with Pathwest, nothing to do with this case. His DNA was found on vegetation to do with Jane Rimmer, and also the caretaker from the riding school. His DNA happened to be on the vegetation that they recovered in the area where Jane Rimmer was found. Tim?
Yeah, I mean, it was
like all this DNA from...
It was a bit of a shopping list, to be honest, of various contributors on numerous exhibits, it would seem, over various time frames. So, as Ali said...
maybe the DNA was flying around the room, because, I mean, how else would it get on them? We can't suggest that these people were at the scene.
Yeah, well, they certainly weren't at the scene, but Stephen Darrenthorne, for instance, his DNA was taken as a reference sample to be sent to be used, because he was the one who found the knife close to James' body. So his DNA would have been taken. So there would have been a sample there. For instance, obviously Laurie Webb, Louise King, Scott Egan, and Alex Bogdanovicius. They were all involved in the testing of various exhibits.
Oh,
so
Tim, intimate swabs, actually, from both the girls. Intimate swabs.
Yes, and so it's embarrassing. It's absolutely embarrassing. It's not a good look for Pathwest, who even in '96 were the premier lab in the state to do this type of work, and it's certainly embarrassing to have Laurie Webb's name connected with this, because he was the senior forensic scientist, and Scott Egan, who's now the reporting scientist. It was not a good look, and it was something I'm sure Ms. Barbara Gallo would rather she didn't
not
have
here.
to deal with.
As one of the defence lawyers actually said to me just as he walked out of court, after listening to it, one of our fairly well-known defence lawyers said, well, it's about time that place got a shake-up. So that was his quip as he walked out.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about, multiple exhibits now, and
bearing DNA.
Yes, that have DNA that should not be there. And the question is, how did it get there?
Yeah, well, that is the question. We've heard numerous times over the course of the cross-examinations about gloves and PPE and caps and lab coats, and who was touching what, single-use implements, all those elements thrown into it, going back obviously nearly more than 20 years, when the samples were first taken and first placed into storage, and they've readily admitted, many scientists now have readily admitted that the processes back in the 2000, before 2000, were rudimentary, to say the least, compared to what they are now. But they've also all said we tried to take as much care as we could, even back in the day, to make sure that we weren't touching anything that we shouldn't be touching with bare hands or with contaminated gloves or whatever. But these results would seem to suggest that those processes were liable to break down more than once.
I guess some people may say, all right, well, this is the DNA of Pathwest employees. At the end of the day, we can understand, that there may be some cross-contamination, but does it really, is it really such a blow to the prosecution case?
Well, when you're talking about maybe the Pathwest's DNA, but what about the stranger? What about the DNA that came from the riding school guy? What about the DNA, it's not anyone to do with Pathwest or this case? Apparently a victim of another crime. That's mixed. That's all gone into the mix-up.
So tell us the details of that one.
The victim, this unrelated victim, personally I think that could possibly be the most damaging, or the one that Justice Hall looks most closely at, because that is something that is not, as Ali says, it's not to do with a scientist, and it's not to do with even anyone, a secondary sort of interest in the case. This is someone completely different, from a completely different case, that has somehow found its way onto an exhibit that was deemed important enough to be in Pathwest and being tested very, very scrupulously. So when you've got a completely outside influence, if you want to put it that way, somehow coming to be on one of these exhibits, that I would suggest that Justice Hall would say, well, is that how Mr. Edwards' DNA became to be on here? Because it's completely unrelated as far as anyone else was concerned back in 96 and 97, and his DNA was in the lab, albeit a very small sample, but it was certainly still there. So when you look at that, you can see the crossover and the possible similarities. We didn't find out who that victim was or what the case was, and we probably don't need to know, really. But what I'm sure Justice Hall will hope he can find out is if there was an investigation done, and if there was, what results that Pathwest came up with about their internal processes.
So, Tim, just apart from this other unknown victim who's got nothing to do with the case, the guy who found the knife and handed it into the police, who's now deceased, he was the caretaker of the nearby riding school. How come his DNA gets muddled up in the mix?
Yeah, well, another very good question, but I think Justice Hall will probably be asking. So his name did come up. I don't want to get too technical without Brendan there, but there was 9 alleles of his that matched this mixed sample. If it was at a level of court reporting, that wouldn't be enough. That wouldn't be reached a high enough threshold to say, yes, that's definitely his DNA. But the fact that it was him, the fact that he's connected to the case, would suggest, well, it's more likely to be him than, some other random person with those distinguishing biological features. And again, I think we do know actually that they did take a DNA sample from him as an exclusionary sample. Should we put it that way, as a reference sample? But then again, how did that sample get onto this sample, which was an inclement sample as well? It was definitely not something that should have been there if he wasn't a contributor. So once again, it will just be another thing that Justice Hall will have to ponder when he comes to the end of this DNA portion and then the end of the trial. He'll have to weigh it all up.
There has to be some reasonable doubt there.
Well, yeah, and that's exactly what Mr. Jovich was trying to create today, and I've said it in the paper. I think he landed some of his heaviest blows today in terms of creating doubt, not so much about the case in itself, but certainly about Pathwest and what they were doing at that time.
Did Bradley Edwards have any reaction to this information today?
No, he has no reaction to anything.
No, not a great deal. But his parents had an up and down day. I can say that they seemed to be very chipper at lunchtime. But some of the evidence that came out this afternoon regarding the kimono and other things that left them looking a little bit down in the mouth as they left court. But,
yes, he is an extraordinary defendant, because usually you'll see them, even if they're not sort of yelling or whatever, they're shaking their heads or looking down or nodding or getting their lawyer's attention, but he shows absolutely nothing.
Still, after all this time, and we are at, day 53. There was a very interesting scenario brought up by Mr. Jovich about contamination at the end of his cross-examination today.
Well, yes, he ended with a great flourish and he sat down, and this was the story about talking about what the prosecutor said, DNA just doesn't fly across the room. He actually related and got Andrew McDonald to confirm that DNA was found on an exhibit back in this super-duper UK testing lab, which had every cutting-edge technology to make sure it was pure and no contamination, that DNA from an employee that had left the labs up to 2 years earlier, was found on an exhibit. So that caused a great flurry. And he said, yes, we do have every technique in place, but things do happen. And that was one of the most appalling episodes, I guess, of cross-contamination, where this DNA just didn't fly across the room. It seemed to have crossed up several floors, because she had been in the reception room and apparently had never been in the lab. But here it is, a bit of DNA from someone who had left up to 2 years earlier, ending up on an exhibit that they were analysing.
So this is obviously...
it was in a time machine. Because she hadn't worked there for at least a year, or possibly up to 2 years, and somehow it had flown in. Now, Mr. McDonald gave some sort of explanation as possibly somehow her DNA had got into the air conditioning system.
Yeah,
and that had literally been.
So it did fly across the room. Yeah.
And then got into the extraction, or got into the examination somehow, and had settled on this. And he said it was highly unusual, which warranted further investigation.
But this wasn't to do with macro, was it?
Well, I was just about to say that. To paraphrase Mr. Jovich at another point today, I would say, well, so what? Because this is a different lab, a different case, a different country, a different time, and how he could. I understand the point he's trying to make. Well, look, even in the tightest of and most modern facilities, this can happen. But he could. What it has to do with this case, and Mr. Edwards in particular, I can't understand. I see the point he's trying to make, but when you're talking about trying to make specific points about this case, those fingernails, that extract, it bears absolutely no weight on that at all, I don't think.
Well, he's just saying that your lab is not so fantastic after all, because a mistake has been made, and this has happened even though you've got your air flowing in and your special air flowing out and in and out and all your little protective devices. This happened, which was an incredible story that he told about this. And the guy said, yes, it did launch an investigation. They were appalled by it at the time that a piece of DNA from a receptionist turns up on a sample almost 2 years later.
I'm a bit surprised in a way, though, that Carmel Barbagallo didn't object to this in a way, because this is an unrelated case. Why is this being brought up?
He's showing that it's just not as pure as you've said it is, that their techniques aren't as super-duper 100%.
I mean, I agree with that. It was actually Cara Payne, who's one of the more junior co-counsel from Miss Barbagallo. It was her witness, so it was her responsibility to stand up if she wanted and question the relevance. I think I probably would have. I'm not questioning Miss Payne. She's eminently more qualified than me. But sitting back now a few hours later, I just struggle with how can you point to that and then point to Mr. Edwards and say, well, look, if it can happen there, it can happen there. I mean, it's on a different. It's literally on the other side of the planet that this happened. It could not be further away physically, geographically, and in time than what happened in Pathwest in 96 and 97.
Okay, before we go, we just have a question here from James in South Australia. Were there media releases from any time after the date we know that WA Police had evidence of Mr. Edwards' DNA link, in particular releasing breakthrough information? Can we confirm that police were also surveilling Mr. Edwards from this time onwards, and if possible, monitoring his behaviour in reaction to the developments? Do you think we would ever hear about this in the trial?
Good question, that. So the short answer is no. So when they first made this the major breakthrough in 2016, they kept it very, very tight-lipped. As we know, they moved very quickly. So from December the 1st, when they got the first hit, Mr. Edwards was arrested and charged on the 22nd and 23rd of December. Going back a little while, I mentioned a couple of weeks ago when the link was first made in public between Karrakatta and Claremont, which was obviously the major breakthrough that was made back in 2008. But that didn't emerge publicly until 2015, when it was reported locally in the very local paper, the Subiaco Post. And I've actually got the press release that police sent out on that day after that report, and I'll read it. It says, for operational reasons, the Macro Task Force has not commented on similar media reports about possible links to other crimes. Maintaining the operational integrity of this investigation is paramount if we are to bring the offender to justice. Therefore, operational outcomes must be prioritised over media and public interest. So that just gives you a little flavour of the type of reply you used to get from WA Police when anything major sort of emerged from the darkness. You used to get a very, very firm but polite no comment on any of these sort of links or developments in the case. And as we know now, that report about the link between Karrakatta and Claremont was absolutely spot on. It had taken nearly 8 years to come to light, but it was right. And very similar statements were made all the way along, until obviously what we talked about yesterday on the podcast when Carl O'Callaghan stood up in that very tense press conference and said what he said, and 3 years on, here we are.
That's right.
In terms of surveillance of Mr. Edwards, that again only started very soon after that DNA hit in 2016. So, as we understand it, the 1st of December was when the link was made. Then they went back to the case file, got the fingerprint from the other Huntingdale break-ins, made the link to Hollywood, and that's when they got the name. And that took a little while. So the surveillance of Mr. Edwards, they weren't sat outside his house and outside his work for weeks and weeks and weeks. That surveillance was short and sharp, and it got him at the cinema, and it got the Sprite bottle out of the bin, which was then the presumptive DNA test, if you want to call it that, which showed yes, and then the raid occurred the TRG raid that we talked about yesterday occurred very, very quickly after that.
Yes, they moved very quickly, but what we can tell you, James, is up until that point, they absolutely ran a very tight ship. All right, well, thank you both for joining us today. Tomorrow we'll be back with Damien Cripps, that's Tim and myself, and we look forward to your company then when we will wrap up week 12.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.